Hey, what's going on, guys? I'm Alex Aguilar and you're watching Cars for Geeks. Now, today's video is actually gonna be more of a opinion and subject to discuss regarding the modern muscle car era and how it's gonna change in the years to come. And for that, I'm gonna go a little back to the original muscle car era, and then I'm gonna go how we went from that to the Great Depression of muscle cars in the 70s and 80s, and how we rised up back to where we are right now, where we have 800 horsepower vehicles being sold in dealerships across the world. And for that, I'm gonna start with the original muscle car era. Now, the original muscle car era started in the 60s, where every American manufacturer started with the idea race on Sunday, buy on Monday, which basically meant you would have tremendous V8s stacked on your average vehicles, raced on NASCAR or something like that, and will sell on your dealerships on Monday. And that idea, that thought, gave birth to many of the most iconic American cars ever made, from the Chevy 3.5, the 57, 56 Chevy Bel Air, even the Dodge Daytona Charger and the Plymouth Superbird were originated from that thought. All those massive V8 cars started from there, and of course this all became wild in the 60s with the introduction of muscle cars as a specific segment of car to be sold to the public. Now, during the early 60s, there were many cars, the GTOs, the Chevelles, and then it went wild out of proportion, and it blew up on the late 60s and the early 70s with the Chevelle SS, with the 427 V8, Dodge with the 426 Hemi making over 400 horsepower. They were just massive engines on these vehicles, and it was just the thought was to get to go as fast as you could on a straight line and have ridiculous drag times for the time. But as you can all probably guess, all good things must come to an end, and all of this came to an abrupt end in the early 70s with the huge oil recession and depression. This meant that all these Guzzlers V8 cars that we had during the 60s were just now obsolete, and being able to afford the gas in 73 was just impossible to the same level you could in the 60s. It was just impossible to have a V8 car because it was too expensive. And of course, emission controls entered, and the cars were heavily punished to the point where V8 cars that used to make 300, 400 horsepower could only make a fraction of that power, which was just ridiculous. And the entire performance American V8 era came to an abrupt end during this time. There were attempts, of course, Ford tried to keep the Mustang alive, and the Mustang too, which we all know how that went. And then, of course, the 80s was a time where all of these power restrictions were still available for all of the cars. And these are depressing times for many American enthusiasts, but it's some sort of a building up to where we are right now. During the late 80s, I'm going to talk about specifically GM. GM worked especially hard to start to rebuild that power for the fourth generation Corvette. As you probably know, the fourth generation Corvette, when it started out, it didn't have much power, 200 and something. It wasn't very powerful, but it was a light car. And it was designed specifically to be a performance machine, but it didn't have the power just yet. So General Motors started to research and continue and develop, and the engineering process took all the way to the LT engine, which is a precursor to the famous LS engine, which is now pretty much on every modern General Motors vehicle of high performance. So that's the Corvette. And they also work with turbos, which is something not as mentioned by many, and it's more of a cult thing with the Buick Regal and the Buick Grand National. Now, the Buick Regal was a personal luxury coupe, which was a big car. But Buick started to little tinkering with the engine. They put a V6 turbo in it, which made 200 and something horsepower, which was an impressive figure back in the 80s. And then they dialed up to 11 with the Grand National and the GNX Grand National Experimental, which were heavily modified versions of these cars. And they were extremely powerful and had performance like nothing else on the road back in the United States. But because we talk about General Motors, they didn't want their signature car or fastest car to be a Buick, so they of course kept it quiet and underrated the GNX and the Grand National, making it as the making it seem like the only powerful car they had in their hands was the Corvette, which of course was not the case. Now, so let's go a little forward. What happened during the early 90s? Well, during the early 90s, Ford had already been working on the Fox body platform of the Mustang and developed some powerful and performance versions of this car, some turbo, some not, experimenting a little bit with the platform. They eventually led up to the swan song, as to what they call, of the Fox body Mustang, the Cobra R and the SVT Cobra and the SVT Cobra R, which were just the ultimate Mustang you could buy in 92 and 93. These cars were just powerful. I mean, not as powerful as they are today, but they were powerful for those days. And they were very light and they performed like nothing else Ford ever had manufactured up until that point. And the truth is that it gave birth to SVT, a Special Vehicle Team division of Ford, which eventually developed the Lightning and many other powerful vehicles. And it led to the 90s being more of a research development era that we will build up to the early 2000s. Now, I'm going to fast forward a little bit, so I'm going to skip on some things and that may be crucial to you, but I'm going to just, all right, so let's go with it. So, General Motors, having developed the LT engine, decided to put it in the Camaro and the Trans Am Firebird of that generation. This led to two very powerful vehicles that, in my opinion, I don't know if it's yours as well, were the original modern performance muscle cars in the 90s. These produced over 200 horsepower, the Camaro and the Trans Am, and although their design is now currently very polarizing and not as well received and haven't aged as well as others, I think they're very cool cars and they deserve a lot more credit than they're given to, because they were the first 90s muscle cars to make over 300 horsepower, and that is something to be proud of. But of course, sales dropped until on the early 2000s, and eventually General Motors killed both of those cars. Now, the Corvette, on the other hand, was kept alive and produced over 300 horsepower on some versions. The Grand Sport, which became iconic due to the Gran Turismo game, and also some other like the Collector Edition with silver paint, and very special editions like the CR1. So General Motors was already back on the game of performance machines. Also, the Cyclone, which is a very underrated mini pickup from the 90s, and I think an unsung hero of the 90s performance era, which defeated a Ferrari 248 in a drag race, and of course its counterpart, the Typhoon. But I'm getting a little bit off topic. Ford, on the other hand, continued with the fourth generation Mustang, which again is a polarizing vehicle of the 90s, and it didn't make as much power as the General Motors cars. But they kept building on it. They developed the Cobra version of the car, which wasn't as powerful, but it was still decent performing. And of course, we're talking about Dodge now, and Chrysler. And Chrysler did something nobody really expected, and they built the ultimate nostalgia machine on the Viper, which was a recreation of the Shelby Cobra, and as wild, if not wilder, than the original. So Dodge was back again on the performance department. So all of the three now in the 90s are building up to something, but no one is quite sure where this is gonna go. Dodge has a V10 massive powered little car. Ford is building the Cobra cars again, and General Motors has a decent V8 engine for the first time in God's how many long. So let's enter to the 2000s, and the 2000s start rough. The muscle car apparently are gone, but the performance is there. The performance is already being developed by all of these companies. But General Motors decides to kill the Camaro and the Trans Am, and decides to keep on with just the Corvette. Dodge, on the other hand, starts to develop more and more high-performance vehicles, but they stick with the Viper as their signature sports vehicle and nothing else. And Ford, on the other hand, Ford continues with the Mustang, and they continue to develop more and more versions. The Mach 1, which I think is one of the most underrated fourth generation Mustangs ever made, I think is the prettiest one of them all. The Bullet version, of course, and the Cobra Terminator, which was a heavily underrated muscle car of the early 2000s, and that makes an unbelievable amount of horsepower for a car of that time. So what happens and what brings back this modern muscle car era? I have one car for you, and I own it. The 2005 Ford Mustang GT. The fifth generation Mustang GT is the genesis of the modern muscle car era. It had a looks, it had a horsepower, it had a performance, it was just the whole package. It was as it was recreated from the 60s, from the 21st century. It is the perfect translation for a retro-inspired car to this day, in my opinion. In my opinion. So of course, Ford takes out the Mustang, and the Mustang crushes everything on its path. Nobody can believe that a Mustang can look this good and still resemble the original, which is something unbelievable. And of course, this shakes everything up for everyone. General Motors decides to bring back the Camaro. Chrysler, which was already working on the Charger and unveils it in 2005, decides to make a coupe version of the Charger to compete with the Mustang. And we have nowadays, in 2006, just a year after it had been launched into the market, we have now an unveiled prototype of the Challenger and of the Camaro, which completes the three companies' offerings as the modern muscle car era. And now we have three massive V8 cars competing one against each other to see which one is the better one. Of course, Ford had a head start with the Mustang, and they unveiled a Shelby version of the car, which was something again that was groundbreaking for everyone, because nobody thought that Shelby would again put his signature on a car after Shelby working for Dodge in the 80s. But it happened. We had a brand new Shelby GT500 in 2006, which made 400 horsepower, and it had a 4GT derived supercharged V8, which was something incredible, and I think most of the times underrated. And then General Motors and Chrysler bring out their offerings, the Camaro and the Challenger, and both of these cars have over 400 horsepower. So no one's kidding around this time. No one's kidding around. And of course, Ford is forced to develop an even better version of the Mustang that can compete with the base versions of the Camaro and the Challenger. And the war ensues. The war just blows up out of proportion, and everyone starts increasing the horsepower on every upcoming version of their cars. Ford starts developing the 5.0 Coyote engine. Camaro and Challenger, they both have the CLA, the CL1, the C28. Challenger goes wild with the SRT, SRT8. Everything just goes out of proportion. Everything just blows up. Everyone is at war with each other. Nobody cares. Everybody just wants to make sure that they have the biggest amount of horsepower on a V8 engine. And that's how it unfolds. And I can continue to explaining with a lot of detail how this ended up, but I'm just gonna cut straight ahead to where we are right now. Right now we have Dodge offering 800 horsepower vehicles on the Charger and the Challenger. Ford went wild with the last Shelby GT500, making 760 horsepower, which for a rear-wheel drive car sounds just insane, especially if it's track-focused. And of course, General Motors goes insane with the C28 and CL1 versions of the Camaro as well. And so we're right now on another golden era of performance. Sure, there aren't as many cars as they were in the 60s, like the Coronet, like the Chevelle, like a GTO. We don't have all of those names. However, we have a similar version of them. We have even more power, and we have the same wild colors that were brought back. Lime green, sublime green in the case of Mopar, plum crazy, which is a beautiful color, grabber blue, grabber lime. All of those iconic 60s colors were again brought back for this new modern muscle car era. So we're now currently living on a throwback to the 60s. But let's look at the landscape in general of the automotive industry, and we're going to see something that is pretty baffling. It is that this has an expiration date. We're living unlimited days for this modern muscle car era, and that is something that many people don't talk about because it's an undeniable subject that needs to be addressed because of what's going to happen with modern muscle cars. And it leads to this point, I think. The entire landscape of the automotive industry points out to the entire landscape of the automotive industry points out to shifting every car they build to electric. Every car, every majorly produced car is going to be electric at some point or the other. Eventually, that's the case. And what's going to happen to muscle cars? And I think that they're going to be still being produced for a more niche market, more than they already are, until regulations from the country where they're being produced eventually shuts them off. Because I think that's the only way it's going to stop. Until regulations become so strict that no fuel cars can be sold to the public, I think they're going to keep building on them, which is a rare. It's a hard date to point out. It's a hard date to put a pin on because these cars are still high on demand. There are many cars that there are many enthusiasts that still want a brand new Mustang, that still want a brand new Challenger, and that they're willing to pay over sticker for special editions like the Demon, like the Hellcat, for a location, for a specific color. All of these crazy car people like us, the enthusiasts, are still thriving to want a V8 massive muscle car, and it's never gonna die out. But the point is that because it's never gonna die out, and enthusiasts are gonna keep wanting V8 cars, where the moment they stop being produced, which is of course in the near future, is gonna drive the prices up highly and to an exponential level like never seen before. Well, it has been seen before in the 60s, but all the modern muscle cars that we have now, that we have been having for the past 15 years, since 2005 to 2006, are gonna rise up in value like nothing else on the road. And it's gonna be extremely ridiculous because right now you can buy some of these cars for as low as $15,000 or so. I'm in Mexico. I bought my 2006 Mustang for the equivalent of almost $7,000, which is ridiculous for the amount of car I got. But the point is that all of those cars that are cheap right now are gonna just skyrocket to ridiculous amounts of money, and people are gonna pay for them because it's gonna be the only way they can experience an old school V8 car like the years before. And it's gonna thrive everything, and of course, it's gonna be more limited to a certain type of a buyer, not everyone like nowadays. And it's a sad thing, really, because it means that my kids probably, if I have kids, will probably be able to afford, and in some point in the future, a V8 car that is in ridiculous in the amount of money it costs. So I'm gonna close this video with this little conclusion. And the thing is that I bought my car fairly cheap, and I consider that I got more car than what I paid for actually. I think what's kind of a steal, if I can say that. And I think that you owe it to yourself. If you're a car enthusiast, and if you can afford a muscle car right now or in the near future, you should start looking out for what car you want to own, because it's something that's gonna last for limited only, and you're gonna really regret not being able to buy an affordable V8 muscle car now and or in the future. Many enthusiasts like cars, and I think I've always grown up surrounded by cars. I mean, look at my room; it's just toy cars everywhere. And the truth is that every time I put my foot on the gas pedal of my Mustang, it just feels like nothing else. I know it's not as fast as many modern cars. I know it's heavy, and I know that it doesn't sound as great as many other V8 engines, but I love that car. I love that car, and I love for what it represents. I love for what it stands for, and I love the way it makes me feel every time I drive it. And if you're really a car enthusiast, and if you at minimum like V8 cars, you owe it to yourself to experience it at least once. And it's my strong suggestion to you, the viewer, that you buy one of these cars. Well, they're cheap because they're not going to be cheap forever. So that was me. I'm Alex Aguilar. I really thank you for your support. I already hit 250 subscribers, which is something I never thought of. I'm gonna keep posting videos like this, more style like this, and this type of blog. If you like the video, please leave a like. If not, you give me and leave me in the comments why you didn't like the video. I can build up on that feedback. And if you haven't followed me already, I have an Instagram page, I have a Facebook page, and you can leave any suggestions and comments for the future videos. So that was all. I really thank you all, and I'm gonna keep posting as much as I can. See you later.